I'm going to do a quick presentation for you guys and girls and anyone else in between. History of gambling in baseball, the myth versus reality. This presentation came out of something that I do here in the town that I live in. I live in a town called Batavia. You can see it in script here. I'm very proud of where we live. And I'm originally from Chicago, but live in Batavia now with my wife and my kids. Help coach the baseball team there at Batavia High School, my favorite squad. In Batavia here, we started a thing during COVID called the Lyceum. And every month we have a different person come in and do an hour-long presentation with an hour-long Q&A at a local bar and restaurant where we talk about topics that are of interest to people that want to present. And being that I love baseball, I've loved baseball from the time that I don't even remember, more than 40 years ago. It came out of the idea that there's just a lot of mythology about gambling in baseball. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of gambling in baseball, the Black Sox scandal and some of the myth that went on with that versus the reality. And then also talk a little bit about Pete Rose, who obviously just passed away a couple of months ago. Ironically, Fay Vincent, the former commissioner, passed away today, and he was intricately involved with that fiasco as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about me here. Who am I? Who am I and why am I here? Like Admiral James Stockdale. As I said, I work at a therapeutic day school in the Chicago suburbs. I have been there for about 30 years. I live just about 5 minutes from there with my wife, Katie. Been married for 25 years this year. She puts up with a lot, folks. My kids, Ellie and Jack. Ellie's a senior getting ready to go to college. Jack is a 14-year-old 8th grader. Both are the light of my life. I love them both dearly, as you can imagine. But baseball has been my oldest friend, and it's something that I've been involved with for a long time. About 5 years ago now, I was lucky to get an opportunity to start writing about fantasy baseball in the industry. And I'm a very busy guy. I like being busy. It keeps me out of trouble. So I also work at Fantrax, covering bullpens there on a weekly basis. I also work at Rotoballer, doing a couple of waiver wire pieces on a weekly basis during the season. And I also co-host a podcast right here on the Pitcher List Network with my friends Dave Funnell and Chris Torres that we do on a weekly basis, where we have beat writers come in and tell us a little bit about the teams that they're covering and some of the fantasy implications that there might be for that. It's called the Fantasy Baseball Beat. Shameless plug. If you've listened to it before, we appreciate you. If you haven't, give us a chance. We're doing some really good stuff there. Just had Laura Albanese on talking about the Mets this past week. You might hear my voice sounds a little shaky. I've been battling the flu all week. This is like the longest I've been sitting upright in about 4 or 5 days. So if you bear with me, we'll get through this. Okay. So kind of wanted to give you a thumbnail of betting in baseball. And betting goes back to the beginnings of organized baseball. In the 1870s, it was very common for players and fans alike in the stands to bet with each other on the outcomes of games. So Super Bowl Sunday is next weekend, right? And many of you will get together with friends and family and have prop bets, right? Betting on how long the national anthem lasts, betting on what songs Kendrick's going to play at halftime, which I'm looking forward to. I love that guy. But these are like prop bets that people would make in the stands. The first ban for gambling in baseball goes back to 1865. I don't know if anybody knows that, but there were 3 players from the Mutual Club of New York City who took $100 each to lose to the Eckford Club of Brooklyn. And those 3 players were banned for life for gambling on the game. Ironically, the people in the stands were making the same bets, and it was not governed, or there was no authority for anybody to stop it or keep them from doing it. So that's the first a recognition that we have in history of players being banned for gambling. In 1877, fast forward about 12 years, Louisville ace pitcher Jim Devlin is banned from baseball for losing exhibition and league games for money. This stuns fans and leads to the next generation kind of being in fear. Things clean up a bit, or more likely was that there was just a little bit under better disguise. They figured out different ways to be able to do it. The American League starts play in 1901 and is immediately hit with gambling allegations. Their new league president was a guy named Ban Johnson, and he orders all betting to be eliminated in stadiums. And everybody just says, yeah, right, Ban. Okay, cool. Say what you want, but we're not doing away with it. It was a rule that nobody could enforce. So Ban Johnson and Charles Comiskey, ironically, who is part of the Black Sox scandal, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, they formed the National Baseball Commission to establish rules on issues. And it's a 3-person committee designed to be able to break ties, ostensibly, right? So it's kind of an interesting situation there. The first World Series, many of you probably know this, was played in 1903. There was a bribery attempt in that first World Series to Cy Young, who everybody knows who he is and the winningest pitcher in the history of Major League Baseball. But he was offered a bribe to lose the game on purpose. Now, what some of you may not know is that Cy Young had his own personal catcher who went with him every town that he went to. And his personal catcher's name was Lou Krieger. And Krieger was a typical, if you think about a backup catcher, he was your typical, backup catcher, your Eric Kratz, your, Mark Hill. We could go back through an eternity of backup catchers. Good catcher, couldn't hit. But Cy Young tells Krieger about this, and Krieger goes to Ban Johnson and says, hey, I just want to let you know, Cy Young got offered this deal to lose on purpose. And because of his honesty, they were able to snuff the guy out that was trying to get him to bet. And Krieger won a lifetime appointment to a job that didn't exist in MLB. He drew a pension and had a job that was really not a job at all. Because of his honesty. And so Ban Johnson wanted to make an example of that. And, there were a lot of guys that were not going to follow that example. When pennant races were over during this time period, this is an important caveat, I felt. Players would ease up down the stretch in September, and gamblers saw this as a way to fix games to line their pockets before betting on the World Series. So the money might be low in the till, right? In the till. And they knew that players were taking it easy as they were getting ready for the quote-unquote playoffs. Now, remember here, and I know people know this, I'm just pointing it out again. Back then, they didn't have an expanded playoff system like what we have now. You won the American League pennant, you won the National League pennant, and then you played for the World Series. And quite honestly, the league was more interested in winning the league than they were necessarily winning the World Series. The World Series didn't have the kind of muster that it has now, right? So winning the pennant was seen as a bigger deal than winning the World Series during this time period. So gamblers would approach players in September knowing that they were rife for the taking and that they, for a few bucks, that they would give them information or that they would be willing to lose on purpose or do point shaving to be able to make some money on the side. Back then, the salaries obviously were nothing like what they are now, correct? Right. So we know that there's reasons why people would be willing to throw games to be able to make some money. And so that happened fairly often in Septembers of baseball seasons when the pennant race was already locked up. Teams did favors for each other during these times too. For example, a player trying to win a batting title, a team that was trying to finish in the top 4 of each league for a share of first division money. So remember back then there were only 8 teams per league. So there were only 16 teams in MLB. If you finished in the top 4 of your league, you finished in the first division, you got paid extra money for that. So there was definitely some reason to play down the stretch if you were in the money for getting in the first division. The example here was the Napoleon Lajoie versus Ty Cobb for the batting title in 1910. You might have heard of this, a little bit of a scandal. The St. Louis Browns were playing Napoleon Lajoie's team, which was the Cleveland Spiders then. Ty Cobb took the weekend off and was hitting .385. He didn't play that weekend. The Browns hated Cobb so much and were trying to help Lajoie because Lajoie was a popular player where Cobb was not, that people on Lajoie's team on the Spiders actually paid the Browns $20 each to have the third baseman play back. And Lajoie laid down 8 bunts in 2 games that weekend to get the batting title. Subsequently, which was interesting, and if any of you follow Sabre and have done any research there, you might realize that actually Ty Cobb ended up winning the batting title on a mistake. He was given double credit for hits in the last weekend that he had played. Subsequently, they went back and changed that record. Lajoie now has the record for the 1910 batting title. but there was a car that was being given away, and nobody wanted to see Cobb win. The Chalmers was giving away a car at that time. They ended up giving cars to both guys, but there was a little bit of dirty pool, right? There were guys that were willing to kind of do those things and, help another guy out. MLB decides in 1920 to hire a commissioner, and his name is Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. It sounds like something that's made up out of the natural or something, doesn't it? Like Bernard Malamud could have written that or whatever. But Kennesaw Mountain Landis was a real person, and he had a real air for flamboyancy and for showmanship, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Oops. Okay. Another thumbnail here that's quick to point out. Baseball players have long had a history of hanging out in homes of ill repute. If any of you were a baseball player, and I'm sure many of you were, and I was through, back through my school days, baseball players hang around in bad spots, right? Saloons, bars, pool halls, brothels, places where local rowdy people hung out. And so they were surrounded by degenerates. And in the early 1900s, baseball was seen as a sport that was not a very good profession for people to be involved in. It was seen as low. It was seen as uncouth. It was seen as not a great way to be able to make money, and that you were going to end up a gambler, an addict, or a bad person, no matter what you did. So those places are always rife with gamblers and lots of cash. People who are willing to buy drinks for players in exchange for information they could use for gambling. Who was pitching the next day? Now we have apps on our phone that tell us who's pitching the next day, right? We can go on Roster Resource and get all the information we want at our fingertips. Back then, those were really tightly kept secrets a lot of the time. Even the other team didn't know. The guys on your team might not even know who was pitching. Which player was hurt and unlikely to play. Who was battling an alcohol problem and couldn't play up to par. This was all knowledge that people were willing to share with gamblers for a fee. So gamblers use that inside information to better inform their practices. Now, keep in mind, too, that at this time in baseball, there were very few educated players at the time and general mistrust for those who were educated. Education then was seen as a mechanism of control for the elite. Similar to some ways we've seen that happen in 2025 as well, right? So, but it was seen as a way for the elite to be in control and not something that was very trustworthy. The first real example that we have of a great baseball player who was involved in gambling was Hal Chase. He was nicknamed Prince Hal. Babe Ruth himself had said that Hal Chase was the best first baseman that he ever saw. Best fielding first baseman that he ever saw. He could hit a little bit as well. Hal Chase was the first baseman to play off the bag, the way that we think of first base being played now. Hal Chase was the guy who invented that. So he was an incredible glove man. He was known for being a great fielder. However, he was also known for being a great hit and run guy as well. He kind of helped invent that idea of doing the hit and run and could do it at any situation, any count. Guy just had great bat control. However, he was also a bit of a turd. Nobody wanted him on their team for a long period of time. So he played for 5 different teams in 12 years. And back then, guys were on the team for however long the team would have them, right? I mean, there was no free agency. Guys didn't just leave in the middle of seasons to go to other places or after a season to go sign a free agent contract. It just didn't happen, right? The rules were very different then. So he was a guy that was moving from team to team quite often, mostly because of his reputation. His gambling was very subtle. He would miss signs on purpose. He would drop throws at first base that he should have had. He would swing and miss purposely on hit and runs so that runners would get thrown out. It was an early form of point shaving. So they would end up winning a game by a run or two instead of winning by 3 or 4 and helping gamblers win money on that. He gambled on baseball games and was known to have a litany of offenses harbored at him by teammates and other players. Excuse me. He made no bones about his attempts to bribe other players. His manager was the legendary Christy Mathewson, who was a much better pitcher than he was manager, and he suspended him for both offering and taking bribes. He made no bones about it. League president John Heidler of the National League whitewashed him, though, and allowed him to come back in because he was a popular player. People liked to come and see him play, and they let it go, even though Christy Mathewson had suspended him. He was formally banned in 1920 with the Black Sox But it was really not a formal ban because he was done playing anyway. So he was pretty much allowed to walk off into the sunset, never played in the major leagues again. But Hal Chase was generally kind of considered the first of the real degenerate type of gamblers that permeated the game in the early part of the 20th century. Heine Zimmerman was another one. Great name, right? Henry Heine Zimmerman played from 1907 through 1919. He won the Triple Crown in 1912. 372 with a whopping 14 home runs and 104 runs batted in. He was a great baseball player, played third base. He was Hal Chase's buddy. Hal Chase got into him and had him gambling on the games as well. They both tried to get players on their team as well as others to throw games on purpose. Their manager was John McGraw. You can imagine that John McGraw was furious. He wanted it to stop. Zimmerman didn't deny it. McGraw cut him from the team in 1919, and he never played again. So these activities kind of set the stage for the biggest gambling crisis in baseball history, which, as a White Sox fan, I have to sadly admit was the White Sox scandal. So the main players in the scandal, the 1919 Black Sox scandal, were Arnold Rothstein, who was an alleged financier of the whole thing, a known mobster. He never directly was involved, though he was implicated. He made a ton of money on the 1919 World Series because he was one of the few smart ones to gamble on the outcome of the entire series, not the outcome of single games. We'll talk about that in a minute. Sport Sullivan and Billy Maharg were degenerate gamblers who arranged the financing. Abe Attell was Abe Rothstein's bagman. He'd been a boxer as well. He was a featherweight champion from Chicago. Sleepy Bill Burns was a former player who was connected to Chick Gandil. Chick Gandil was the Sox starting first baseman who was nearing the end of his career and was looking for a payout, looking for a way to be able to make some money. He knew he was near the end. He was about 33. His play had suffered over the last couple of years, and he was looking to get some cash on his way out the door. Charles Comiskey was the team owner, and seen as very pecunious. He's unfairly seen as cheap. We'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. Gandil knew he couldn't blow the series on his own, so he figured if he got 2 starting pitchers and 3 offensive cogs that he could pull it off. He targeted Eddie Seacott first, who was their star pitcher, Lefty Williams, who was their other pitcher that was very good, and Happy Felsch, who was their starting center fielder. He then opened it up to a meeting for other players who might be interested in. Swede Risberg, their starting shortstop, Buck Weaver, starting third baseman, Shoeless Joe Jackson, starting left fielder, attended a meeting at the Palmer House Hilton downtown to learn more about what was going to happen and what it was going to entail. So Gandil knew that he couldn't get Ray Schalk and Eddie Collins. Why? They were educated. They were college guys. They were also making more money than the other guys because they were more shrewd negotiators than their teammates. So they had no interest in doing that. They didn't even want to talk about it. They weren't even asked to be part of it. So Gandil knew that he needed to do that. Excuse me. He had signed a series of bad contracts because he was a jumper. He would go to the highest bidder and would leave teams in the middle of the season. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute as well. So the 1919 Black Sox, often referred to as the 8 men out, were the 8 guys that ended up getting kicked out of baseball in 1920 after the deal was done. So Charles Chick Gandil was the organizer. Shoeless Joe Jackson obviously would have been a Hall of Famer if he had not been involved in this. Charles Swede Risberg was a weak-hitting, strong-arm shortstop, really good fielder, not a very good hitter. Lefty Williams, Eddie Seacott, he was the ace of the pitching staff. George Buck Weaver was an all-star level third baseman. Fred McMullen was a utility player, just happened to be a friend of Gandil's who overheard. He was involved in it even though he didn't play very much. I think he only had 3 at-bats in the whole series. And Oscar Happy Felsch was the 8th guy who was involved. Sorry, skipped a slide there. Get too fast. Much of what we know of the scandal comes from a book that was written in 1963 by a guy named Elliot Asanoff, and the book was called 8 Men Out. In fact, the first research paper that I ever wrote in high school as a 15-year-old sophomore was based on this book. And of course, as a 15-year-old guy, I'm naive as all get out, and believed everything that I read in there and came away with it feeling really sorry for guys like Joe Jackson and Buck Weaver and felt like they had been railroaded and wrote a research paper based on this book. Well, come to find out in the 1990s and the 2000s, SABR, Society for American Baseball Research, has done some phenomenal work in uncovering the truth about a lot of these things that went on during the Black Sox scandal. The book was constructed on anecdotal evidence years later, and there's a lack of facts. And a lot of it was aggrandized for Hollywood and for writing the book, right? We found out later on that there are actual parts of the book that Asanoff completely fabricated that weren't true. You probably have heard the famous kid on the courthouse steps saying, "Say it ain't so, Joe," when they were coming out of the courthouse. And Joe says, "Yeah, kid, it's actually true." That's made up, didn't happen. There's just a lot of things that were fabricated to try to cast them as victims, when in fact, I would argue that they were not victims and they knew exactly what they were doing. Charles Comiskey is held as miserly, but the thing that I would like to point out is that the 1919 White Sox had the highest payroll in baseball at $88,000. Now, many of us make more than that in our day jobs now, which is pretty cool, but that was what their payroll was in 1919. If you look at the slide, you can see what we have there. Buck Weaver was making $72.50. Seacott made $8,000. Happy Felsch $37.50. Gandil $3,500. Jackson $6,000. Williams $3,500. Risberg $32.50. McMullen $3,000. By comparison, Babe Ruth was making $10,000 a year at that time. He subsequently made much more later on. After the season he puts up in 1920, he gets paid, right? The players were not underpaid, as has been suggested. They were actually getting paid pretty fairly. The one exception that you might look at is Joe Jackson. Now, you might look at that and feel sorry for Joe. Joe was making $6,000, but he was on a prove-it deal, as was Jackson and Felsch. You might ask yourself, why would the greatest hitter on the team be on a prove-it deal? Well, in 1918, there was this little thing called World War I. And to avoid getting drafted, Jackson, Felsch, and Williams jumped the team in the middle of the season and went to work at a shipyard in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore in Maryland. And when they did that, they were banned from playing for the team for the rest of the season. Now, at the end of the season, Comiskey did not want to bring them back for the 1919 season, but the manager of the team, a guy named Kid Gleason, begged and pleaded for them to be able to come back. He went to the shipyard and talked them into coming back after the war was over. And so Comiskey said, well, screw you guys. I'm signing you for, this is a prove-it deal, like what we would refer to today as a pillow contract, right? Go and prove it, and then we'll get you paid. Joe Jackson actually had one of the first contracts in the history of baseball that was a multi-year contract. He took the same price every year for 3 years when he was with Cleveland before he came to the White Sox. Story for a different time. There's another myth that was part of this as well. You might know that Eddie Seacott had a clause in his contract, supposedly, that if he won 30 games, that he was to be paid a $10,000 bonus. That's something that's been written about. It's something that's I've seen on the internet many, many times. There was no such bonus. Seacott had a sore elbow and shoulder down the stretch, and they rested him to be ready for the World Series. He was not withheld from trying to win his 30th game. In fact, he had 4 or 5 different opportunities down the stretch to win his 30th game to get his mythical bonus. It didn't exist. So that's something that's not real. Gandil and Seacott were the ones who approached the gamblers to see if they had interest, not vice versa. The gamblers did not come to them and say, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't you blow the World Series? They went to them and said, hey, we think we can get enough guys together to lose the World Series on purpose. Would you guys be interested? Gandil was the linchpin. He was the brains of the organization and the player with the biggest beef. He had been signed to contracts under value for the last few years because in the early 19 teens, he had jumped and gone to Mexico and California and was always threatening to leave to play in California. He was from California. His wife wanted to stay there. He was constantly threatening to leave. In fact, one of the things that's interesting about Gandil, and you can look this up on SABR in your free time if you want to, is that he had a monthly contract because he was always threatening to jump. and his monthly contract paid him $666 every month. Do the math on that. Think about it what you will. An evil guy knowing that he was evil doing the 666 thing, right? The players were promised when the deal came together for the scandal, they were promised $20,000 for each game lost in the series, which was a best of 9 series then, not a best of 7. So media scrutiny began immediately. There were indications that something was amiss early on. Money line shifted very, very quickly back and forth. The White Sox had been prohibitive favorites, even though the Reds were an outstanding team. Shout out to Doug Dennis, my favorite Reds fan. It was going to be a closer series than what people thought it was going to be. But when the money line shifted, the sports writers started to take notice, and there was some concern. The Sox lost the first 2 games on purpose, but when the payouts didn't come in immediately, they decided to play to win Game 3, and they did, in fact, win Game 3. Ironically, Chick Gandil had the game-winning hit, a 2-run single that ended up letting them win the game by 2 runs. This put the Gamblers in a really precarious position. Many were gambling on individual games as opposed to the entire series. So Billy Maharg, who was one of the guys that they had approached about setting it up, lost tens of $1,000s on Game 3. To be able to make sure that the White Sox were going to lose from there on out, they coughed up $20,000 before Game 5, which Gandil got, and then split allegedly between Risberg, Felsch, and Williams, who was pitching the next day. So each one of those guys got $5,000 the night before. Seacott got $10,000 the night before Game 1 of the World Series. It was under his pillow in his hotel room. Unbeknownst to the other guys, Gandil was working with another set of gamblers and kept money from the other conspirators and bet on the series throughout a second avenue as well. Excuse me. And those guys didn't know that. So games 1, 2, 5, and 8 were known to have been purposely lost. When the money did not come through for games 3, 6, and 7, however, the Sox won those games. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. They're showing the guys like, hey, look, if you guys don't pay up, we'll just go ahead and try to win. And they did. They made no bones about it. Rothstein did not bet on individual games. We had talked about him a little bit before, but bet on Cincinnati to win the series to the tune of $270,000. 1919, $270,000. He and Gandil were the only guys to get rich off of this deal, which is part of the tragedy of the whole thing. The only player to get rich off of it was Gandil, estimated to have made between $35,000 and $60,000 through his gambling activity in the 1919 World Series. He repeatedly denied that he got that amount of money. Later on, when he was nearing the end of his life, he gave an interview in the early 1970s to Sports Illustrated, in which he continued to deny that he had taken money for losing the series, and everybody kind of raised an eyebrow and said, well, it's like the worst kept secret around. Everybody knows that you did. Those are rumors of what the payouts were. They could have been more. Seacott got $10,000, and that was all he got. Shoeless Joe, $5,000. Williams, Felsch, Risberg, McMullen each got $5,000. Buck Weaver says he got nothing. Allegedly, he's claimed that till his dying day. But the other guys, none of them got very rich off of the deal, which is sort of perplexing. This is the thing that I want you to take away from it. The winner's share of the 1919 World Series was $5,200. So if the White Sox had played to win and had won, 6 of the 8 conspirators would have made more money than they had made playing to lose. Think about that. Isn't that wild? They thought they were going to get $20,000 each, and most of them only cleared about $5,000 out of it. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? Shoeless Joe, let's talk about him real quick. I know we're about halfway through our time here. Shoeless Joe Jackson, what a player, huh? For those of you who follow baseball or baseball historians, you might have heard some of the legendary stories about him and Black Betsy. I put a picture of the bat here for you to be able to see, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with gambling, because Black Betsy is a historically incredibly valuable and really interesting bat. It was built for him, made for him, when he was a 15-year-old kid playing in the fields in South Carolina. He worked in mining towns from the time that he was 8 years old, and a fan made him this bat. And you can see that the bat has an unnatural curve to it, because it was made by somebody who wasn't a professional bat maker. The bat had that curve to it. He started using it when he was 15. Now this bat, the picture doesn't do it justice. It's 36 inches, and at its heaviest was 48 ounces. It's like swinging a tree branch. And what he would do is the curved side, you can see how it's lopsided, the curved side, he would aim that towards the pitcher. And when he hit the ball and when he pulled it down the line, you can imagine the kind of spin that he was getting when he hit that ball hard. In 1911, Black Betsy got a crack in the handle, and he paid somebody to fix it at Hillerich and Bradsby down in Louisville, and they put a big staple in the bottom of it. If you look up pictures of Black Betsy, you can still see that staple in it to this day. And he wrapped it with that tape that's on there that you can see is electrical tape. He used it to be able to keep the handle together. He carried this bat in a special case his entire career. In fact, in 2016, Black Betsy sold for $583,000. Boy, wish I could have a piece of that with Ellie getting ready to go to college next year. That would help defray costs quite a bit. But he was known as one of the best hitters of his generation. Babe Ruth actually credited him with learning how to hit the ball with authority, batting left-handed. The really interesting guy. He was the son of a Carolina sharecropper. He went to work in the mills at about age 8. And when he played on the mill teams, he would go to the highest bidding team on a weekly basis. So whoever had games that weekend and wanted to employ him would employ him in the mill that week, and he would play for them on Saturday and Sunday. He started out as a pitcher. However, the first time he pitched, the first guy that he ever pitched to, he broke the guy's arm. And so teams would refuse to play him because he was so good if he was pitching. So they put him in the outfield and just let him hit instead. The shoeless moniker is true. That came from having played several games because his spikes were too tight, playing in his stocking feet on the field. He was also illiterate. And I don't know if a lot of you know that or not, but his first contracts with the White Sox were signed with an X. There's a room at the old Comiskey Park called the Bard's Room. Maybe some of you have heard of it or been in there. And his contract was in there with an X. He could not read a menu. He could not sign autographs. His wife did that for him. When he would go to restaurants with his teammates, he would just listen to hear what they were having and order something that they were having because he couldn't read or write. He did not like leaving South Carolina. He was homesick as soon as he signed a contract. When people saw him play, he was purchased for $900 by the Philadelphia Athletics, and it didn't work out so great because he didn't want to be able to leave South Carolina. He just wanted to play on the mill team. Really, if you think about the term country bumpkin, he was that guy, you know. He definitely would have been a Hall of Famer. The guy's a lifetime 356 batting average, OPS plus of 170. For those of you who don't know what OPS plus is, everybody here knows that, right? You're pitcher list fans, whatever. 70% better than his peers. I mean, are you kidding me? The guy was just an absolute freakishly talented hitter. He hit 408 in 1911 and didn't lead the league. Ty Cobb did, hit 419. He jumped the team to avoid the draft in 1918, part of why he had a prove-it contract. We were talking about that. But Jackson would later claim in the trial that he didn't know why he was taking money. He is a liar. The day after the World Series was over down in South Carolina, he deposited $5,000 in the bank and told his wife about it and said, "I'm ashamed. I took this money." And she's like, "All right, well, we got it, so let's, put it in the bank and use it." The guys were put on trial in 1920 for conspiracy to defraud the public. They were acquitted of criminal charges. Some grand jury testimony miraculously disappeared. And technically, losing baseball games on purpose was not a crime per se. Players thought they would be back in the game. And so really what happened was that testimony went missing, and nobody knows exactly why it went missing or where it went. There was a lot of speculation that Comiskey paid somebody to make it disappear because he didn't want to lose his team. There's no real evidence of that. What we know is that the file with the grand jury testimony was found in somebody's basement on the south side of Chicago in a locked police file cabinet that had been in somebody's basement for probably 50 years. And they found that grand jury testimony in there, in which the players admitted in the grand jury testimony that they had taken bribes. Joe Jackson admitted it. Felsch, Gandil, Seacott, they all admitted that they had done it. Charles Comiskey had heard rumors of the fix before the first game, but sat on the information, didn't tell Ban Johnson, didn't tell anybody about it, hoping that it would go away, and it didn't. The National Baseball Commission, which remember we had talked about before, it's a committee of 3 owners, was dissolved, and a commissioner is named, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He's charged with cleaning up the game, and the owners give him absolute power. You do what you have to do to clean it up. So those guys get acquitted in the court of law. They're celebrating, taking pictures with the jurors, having drinks with the jurors in the courtroom after it was over. I mean, it's just completely outlandish, right? Landis comes back and says, hey, you know what? You guys are done. Like, you're banned. You're not going to play anymore in the major leagues. No matter what your level of culpability was, if you were involved and you didn't let anybody know about it and you took money, you're out. Excuse me. None of the 8 ever worked in baseball again. Now, Buck Weaver every year would reapply to be reinstated into MLB, but Landis's stance on that was, you knew about it, you did nothing about it, you said nothing to no one about it. Doesn't matter if you accepted a penny or not, you were complicit. And that ended his career as well. This is where Landis comes in. You could see the shock of gray hair, getting ready to throw out the first pitch very dramatically, very posed. And here were his comments about how very grandiose he was. Now that I'm in baseball, just watch the game I play. If I catch any crook in baseball, the rest of his life is going to be a pretty hot one. I'll go to any means and to anything possible to see that he gets a real penalty for his offense. And this is what his statement after the acquittal. Regardless of the verdict of juries, no player that throws a ball game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a ball game, no player that sits in a conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing ball games are planned and discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play professional baseball. Of course, I don't know that any of these men will apply for reinstatement, but if they do, the above are at least a few of the rules that will be enforced. Just keep in mind that regardless of the verdict of juries, baseball is competent to protect itself against crooks, both inside and outside the game. So the results, those guys were banned. We talked about that already. The 1920 season was rife with speculation. The Black Sox continued to throw games. There were between 5 and 8 instances in 1920. Now, remember, they were not on trial right away. They didn't go on trial until after the 1920 season. Excuse me. Because of that, they were allowed to play the 1920 season despite all the rumors that were going around. And then the admittals started coming out. They were still gambling to lose in 1920 and making more money doing that. We don't know any figures about what they made or whatever, but gambling's largely eradicated by, Landis and the rules that he sets because people see that he wasn't fooling around. It really captured the public imagination, though, right? I mean, was $5,000 worth betraying the trust of your teammates? I would say no. The fans, the game, played with the faith of millions of people. They wrote about it in Great Gatsby, right? I mean, Fitzgerald wrote about it, playing with the faith of millions of people. You could take your heroes, and you could bribe them to lose a game on purpose. The World Series, man, right? So in 1920, thank God for Babe Ruth, because Babe Ruth comes around and hits 54 home runs, more than the totals for every MLB team that year, 25 more than the next guy who had 29, and revitalizes interest after the scandal. Ruth goes on to hit 60 in 1927, which is absurd, and becomes the all-time home run leader until Barry Bonds. And Babe Ruth saved the game. I mean, he brought interest back to the game after the Black Sox scandal. Just a monstrous talent. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, maybe 15. But the other scandal that really rocked baseball was the Pete Rose scandal. And I'm 51 years old. And people of a certain age remember Pete and remember the way that he played and remembered all the stuff that went down around him. And as a kid, my dad had put baseball posters in our room, and one of those posters was Pete Rose. And he was held up as an example to me from a young boy playing in the early 1980s, before many of you were even born or even thought of, probably, as the way to play the game. He played like his hair was on fire. You realize now maybe he really was on fire. You know, he was with the gambling and whatnot. But he was held up as the example of hustle. His nickname Charlie Hustle, for as many of you know. His picture of him sliding headfirst into third base at Wrigley Field. There's another picture of him slamming into Ray Fosse at the 1970 All-Star game. After everything that happened with him in the late 1980s, I often wondered if he had a bet on that game, and that's why he killed Ray Fosse at home plate. Those of you who are older than me obviously know Ray Fosse's career better than I do, but his All-Star career was largely ended on that play because Rose dove into him and broke his collarbone to score the winning run in the 1970 All-Star game. But that's the kind of player he was. He was a hard-nosed and equally liked by some and detested by others. All-time hit leader, 4256. Obviously, Ichiro has more hits if you combine Japan with the United States, but that's not the way this works. He's the all-time hit leader at 4256. Played the most games in MLB history, 3562. Most at-bats in MLB history, 14,053. Lifetime 303 batting average. Had over 200 hits in a season 10 times. He was an all-star at 6 different positions. That's a record nobody's going to break, guys. All 3 outfield spots, first base, second base, and third base. Known for his demeanor on the field, all-out play, and for loving the ponies when he was a player, betting on the horse races. The gambling scandal came about in the late 1980s, 1989. He was questioned by then Commissioner Peter Ueberroth in 1989 about his gambling activities. Bart Giamatti takes over for Ueberroth and hires John Dowd, who's a famous prosecutor, to investigate Rose. The Dowd report, as it comes to be known, finds 52 instances of Rose gambling on the Cincinnati Reds while he was the manager at $10,000 per day. I want you to take that in and really make sure that you wrap your mind around that, because this wasn't $5 FanDuel bets and stuff like that he was doing. These were bets with gamblers, with bookies that he was using the dugout phone for, $10,000 at a time. I mean, think of the amount of money that's changing hands there. Think of the input that he has in making those decisions on the outcomes. So many people will say, well, he bet on the Reds to win. He always said he bet on the Reds to win. So does it make a difference? Like, I mean, he bet on his own team. Like, you just can't do that. So here's the part that a lot of people don't know. And I hope that if you take nothing else away from this, that you'll get this. Rose accepted a voluntary ban from baseball instead of being faced with criminal charges. Because Dowd comes back and Giamatti comes back and says, hey, guess what? You're done. You're out as manager. You're going to be banned from baseball, or we'll take you to court and we'll get you all these charges. You'll face criminal charges. You'll go to jail. And so Pete says, I don't want to go to jail, so I'll take the lifetime ban. But he also thought that he was going to be able to get back in. He thought that he was going to be able to appeal every year to get back in, and he'd eventually bide his time and get back in. You might remember that after he accepts the ban, 9 days later, Giamatti dies of a massive heart attack. And then Fay Vincent takes over, R.I.P. Fay Vincent, who actually just died today. The agreement is listed on the side of this slide here. Major League Baseball would make no finding of fact regarding gambling allegations and cease their investigation. Rose was neither admitting nor denying the charges. He could apply for reinstatement after a year. MLB never planned to take him back, and he was also banned from the Hall of Fame in the process. That's a whole other conversation, my friends. Modern day problems. We've talked about this kind of stuff. We had, Shohei Ohtani's translator Ippei Mizuhara embezzled millions from him last year for gambling. That's the chickens are coming home to roost there. Tucupita Marcano was banned for placing over 400 bets on the Pirates while a team member rehabbing from a knee injury. Bets included more than $150,000. Good for you, Tucupita, for having the money to be able to do that. Parlays, over-unders, but he had inside information and was on an MLB roster. He was banned for life in June of 24. Several other players have gotten one-year bans. Michael Kelly, Jay Groom, Andrew Saalfrank, Jose Rodriguez, lesser amounts. They were able to get back in after a year absence of being suspended. Just a kind of a final thought before we get through the end here. George Will, famous writer, said baseball, it is said, is only a game. That's true. The Grand Canyon's only a hole in Arizona. There's a unique mythology to the game of baseball, and mythology has a tendency to spring up when there's an absence of facts. Mythology was something that came about thousands of years ago to explain things that didn't seem explainable. With the ability to be able to do research now and using things like Saber, we're able to go back and piece together the things that really happened. Don't ever believe that players who are gambling are victims. These are people that are victimizing us as fans and victimizing their teammates and people who are playing on the level. I find baseball to be like church. Many people attend, but really few understand. It's said to be our American pastime. It's rife with challenges, but the game has survived every attempt that's been made to manipulate it, control it. The game marches on, and it's largely unchanged at the molecular level for more than 150 years now. It's a recognizable game, and it's a game that we all love. It's a game that brings all of us together. And that's the thing that I love most about it, is that I'm a passionate baseball fan, a passionate fantasy baseball person. But the thing that I love most about being part of this community is the community. And it's a community that brings people together for great causes like what Nick does here, for us to be able to have a safe place for all, regardless of where you're from, who you are, who your partner is, what sexuality you are. We all are part of this together. And that is something that I aspire to be on a daily basis, is a paragon of being welcoming and of being kind and always showing empathy and always wanting to show an ability to be able to understand. And I thank you for being able to do these types of things. And I never take it for granted that I have been allowed to be part of this industry for the last 5 years. I know that it could all disappear and vanish like a fart in the wind extremely quickly. I love every moment that I'm able to do it. I love the fact that I get to be able to do some of these things and talk about the thing that I'm most passionate about in the world, besides my family, is baseball. And so if anybody has any questions on that, I have a couple of minutes here at the end that I left to answer anything. But if any of you want a copy of this PowerPoint, I know that they're putting stuff up on YouTube later. But if you want me to email it to you, I'd be happy to do that. You can always find me at MDRC0508 on X or whatever they call it now. I don't even know. I've been trying to transition over to Blue Sky. I'm not 100% sure how that works. I'm not the most techie of people, but I'm always around. The last thing I always want to point out before the next crew comes on is, this is a hard time of year for a lot of people with February rolling in now, and weather hopefully starting to get better soon by all of us. Valentine's Day is coming up, and for those of you who are struggling at all with mental health, know that you're not alone, and there's always somebody there to be able to listen. I've been working in the mental health field and education for 30 years. If you ever need resources, you ever need somebody to just vent to, my DMs are always open. Many times that I've picked up the phone and called somebody that I didn't even really know just to be able to check in. Let's continue to be there for each other throughout all of the current level of insanity that we're facing and the chaos of everything that's going on around us, and make sure that we continue to be there for each other.